The Sunday school lesson for this week is entitled Justice and Fairness, and it is focused in the Old Testament book of Exodus, chapter 23, verses 1 through 12. Our goal here is to make sure we learn something after we go through our study. So first, you should be able to identify the ratio of the positive commands, the ones that say do, to the negative ones, the ones that say do not. And then two, why don't you go ahead and see if you can suggest a reason that it is given for these ratios, the numbers of one as opposed to the other. Those are at least two goals you should be able to ascertain in your study. Our lesson outline is divided into two sections, and they cover section 1 that we might call Justice in the Court and in Home, covering verses 1 through 8 of chapter 23. And then section 2 that we can consider learning that justice is shared in the economic matters between people, and that's verses 9 through 12. So in Justice in the Court and in Home, verses 1, 2, and 3 indicate the rules for due process, part 1. Verses 4 and 5, we read how God is sharing through Moses how to help your enemy. And then in verses 6 through 8, 6, 7, and 8, it picks back up again on the rules for due process. So there is an interlude or insert for verses 4 to 5, but it continues back in verses 6, 7, and 8 on due process. In section 2, we read about how justice is shared when men deal in economic matters. Verse 9 covers that, how they should be able to deal with those who are immigrants or migrants in their area. Verse 10 and 11, what do they do on the sabbatical? What is their procedure? What is their practice during the sabbatical year? And then verse 12, on the Sabbath day, how are they to practice their worship? And that's the outline for our lesson today. But now, here are some interesting facts about the book of Exodus. Exodus is a Greek word, and it means exit or to depart or departure, actually going out. The author is credited to be Moses. It is written around 1445 to 1404 BC. Exodus is the second book in the Bible, the second book in the Old Testament, and the second book in the Pentateuch, starting with Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. This book, Exodus, has 40 chapters, 1,200 verses, and over 32,000 words. And here are some observations and factors that you may or may not know about the book of Exodus. Did you know that there are approximately 300 years that separate the book of Exodus from the book of Genesis? Yeah, Exodus is really the record of Israel's birth as a nation, because when they entered into Egypt, they were just Hebrew family members. And 70 people entered Egypt, recorded in chapter 1. Joseph, one of the youngest brothers of Jacob, was already living there. And Exodus covers the period from the arrival of Jacob and the rest of his sons in Egypt, which is approximately around 1875 BC, until they erect the tabernacle in the wilderness when they leave Egypt, which was around 431 years later, which is around 1445. So after the death of Joseph, there was a change of Egyptian dynasty, which really made Israel, or the Hebrew people, a nation of slaves. And that's what we read about how they lived. And then again, the onset of Moses. So Israel's journey in Egypt took place around 1900 to 1400 BC. During that time that Israel was in Egypt, Egypt actually became a really major, powerful world empire. God then raised up Moses to be the deliverer of Israel. And did you know Moses comes from the brother Levi and his descendants, the tribe of Levi, so he was a Levite, part of that tribe that worked in the tabernacle. At the time of the Exodus, there were around 600 men that was over the age of 20, that's how they counted, and that didn't include the women and children. So, what it seems to be that when the Hebrew people left Egypt, there were approximately 2 to 4 million people who left Egypt. That's amazing. And so when God took time to deliver them by parting this Red Sea, and maybe it was one night or a few days later, the interesting fact is that it took the Hebrew people 40 years to get Egypt out of Israel. They had to relinquish, they had to stop practicing, they had to stop participating in all or some of the ways they learned while they were in Egypt. And before God let them go into Canaan, the promised land, he had to make sure they didn't bring any of that with them. You've heard that saying, you can take the country out of the man, but you can't take the man out of the country? Or is it the other way around? You can take the man out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the man. You know. But anyway, with this book, it begins the story of Moses. We learn about how Moses is used by God to deliver the people and to get them to learn about his law. So here we learn that the Egyptians were descendants of Noah's son Ham, and the book of Exodus also records when God commissioned Moses to be the leader of his people, started in chapter 3, moves on to chapter 4. We learn about the plagues that were delivered on the Egyptians because of Pharaoh's hardness, starting in chapter 7, goes on to chapter 11. We learn how they start the Passover, the beginning of that religious ceremony. They clear that and declare it in chapter 12, going on to chapter 13. We read about the opening of the Red Sea. We read about the 10 Commandments, which leads into our lesson today, and that's recorded in chapter 20. God gives them instructions on how to build the tabernacle, started in chapter 24. The 35th chapter of this book, God shares with them how to present the offerings in the tabernacle, the building of the tabernacle also in chapter 35, the erecting of the tabernacle in chapter 40, and then God filling the tabernacle also in chapter 40. So that when we read now in chapter 23, Moses has already been up the mountain speaking to God more than one time. And he brings down the 10 Commandments, but he now starts to give them the covenant code, which is a collection of over 600 rules that the Hebrew people determined to follow as God gave them direction. And Moses is sharing some of these laws, and it deals with how they need to relate to their Hebrew kin, and then those who are not related, those who are immigrants, those who are strangers, and those who are Gentiles. Those are some points that you should reflect on while you're reading through this book, and giving you some context on now how do we get to beyond the 10 Commandments to this covenant code, which shares in many countries and societies today rules on how to interact with others, neighbors, and people who also live in the community. The scriptures, Exodus chapter 23, verses 1 through 12, the New International Version. Do not spread false records or reports. Do not help a guilty person by being a malicious witness. Do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. When you give testimony in a lawsuit, do not pervert justice by siding with the crowd. And do not show favoritism to a poor person in a lawsuit. If you come across your enemy's ox or donkey wandering off, be sure to return it. If you see the donkey of someone who hates you falling down under its load, do not leave it there. Be sure you should help them with it. Do not deny justice to your poor people in their lawsuits. Have nothing to do with a false charge, and do not put an innocent or honest person to death, for I will not acquit the guilty. Do not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds those who see and twists the words of the innocent. Do not oppress a foreigner. You yourselves know how it feels to be foreigners because you were foreigners in Egypt. For 6 years you are to sow your fields and harvest the crops, but during the 7th year let the land lie unplowed and unused. Then the poor among your people may get food from it, and the wild animals may eat what is left. Do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove. 6 days do your work, but on the 7th day do not work, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and so that the slave born in your household and the foreigner living among you may be refreshed. Verses 1 through 12, Exodus chapter 23. So in summary, we should be able to see that as we seek justice, we are able to see a revealing aspect of God's character in the stories in the book of Exodus and even in our chapter today. You should ask yourself, what kind of God do we worship? Well, we learn in this part of our study, chapter 23, that we serve a merciful God, and He practices a commitment to be merciful to all people. And for the people of Israel at that time, they had to learn that God was not going to only punish their enemies or those strangers or Gentiles, but He also shared with them that they needed to experience and demonstrate the same aspect that He was sharing with them. These 600 plus laws of this covenant code in the Old Testament, they do not cover every imaginable circumstance that life presents. Even today, the laws that we have in society do not cover every aspect of what could happen, but what they do for the people of Israel and what they should do for us now is to see that there are enough examples that will allow those who are critical thinkers and more so believers in the teachings of Jesus Christ how they can act in situations similarly, even those not named. This law of Moses invites reflection for the people of Israel and for us contemporary readers today. And it should shape our commitment and our attitude for our life walk, our faith journey. The law of Moses, while it was directed to the people of Israel, giving them some guiding principles for their interaction with life and with temple worship, what it also does is, and it should require you and I to have a practical action that we can employ in demonstrating our love for our fellow man and woman, and even for those people who are challenging and difficult. In this way, And for those people of Israel, as you read this passage, we can fulfill the law that God has said above everything, to love our neighbor as ourselves, to love God and both our neighbors and our enemies, wherever they are found. And the court examples and the examples of what to do with your strangers and immigrants and those who are not from your communities should give you that understanding. The title of our lesson is Justice and Fairness, and I trust that God's Word has given you some reflection in that way. Thank you again for studying with us in this passage of Exodus chapter 23, verses 1 through 12, where we learned more about the covenant code for daily life and interaction with each other, our friends, family, and neighbors. This should give you some understanding of what God intended for how we should engage even today. If you like us, we appreciate that. Share our video, leave a comment, or if you choose to, why don't you take time and subscribe so you look forward to our upcoming videos. We hope that you stay safe and healthy until we study with you again. Dr. Christie.